Thank you so much. So hello, guys. I guess we're a little bit pressed on time, so I will try to talk fast, and there's a lot of slides. So in addition to being Director of Open Source Strategy at Pivotal, I'm actually also a VP of Technology for OhDPI, so I apologize. I will have to do a little bit of branded slides just to basically earn my keep at OhDPI. So, but with that, let's actually talk about why we're here, why I wanted to present to you. I actually liked very much the analogy that Amol gave, that the product vision that he has is kind of like the slick UI of an iPhone application, right? For Apex. Now, this is all nice, but imagine if your iPhone itself came not like this, but basically it would come in a box, full of like bajillion different pieces. And the only way to actually run this nice UI application on that would be you would first have to put all of those pieces together. Because if you think about it, a lot of times that's what Hadoop is still today. Now, you could say, well, what about distributions? Well, distributions actually happen to be the same walled gardens that Apple has, right? And Apple has all, full control over what applications you get to see in the Apple Store. So the fact that none of the major distributions today ship Apex makes it so that you are kind of like completely walled out of that walled garden. So that's no good either. So what are your options? And now you may say, well, but it's a native Yarn application, so we don't really care. So as long as there is Yarn available, we'll just run on Yarn, and that's the end of it. Well, Yarn is fine and nice, and it was a big deal for Hadoop ecosystem when it came out. And it was meant to be the data operating system. And again, it got Hadoop beyond batch. It enabled hosting multiple business cases on a single Hadoop cluster. But really, an operating system, I don't think that it kind of quite solved the end-to-end problem nicely. And it actually allowed some of the container-based orchestration systems to take that use case for application development. And it's really not quite ready for running running services. Slider is still in incubation after 3 or 4 years by now. I don't actually even remember. So Yarn is nice when it's there, and it's kind of part of the Hadoop ecosystem, but it's not really catching on the same way that Kubernetes or any of these other container orchestration systems are catching on. So the reason I'm saying this is not to bash Yarn. It's a fine technology, just to basically lay out this statement that it might not be the case that you will get Yarn by default. Like you go to a cloud provider, it's not the case that you will get Yarn by default. So with all of that in mind, you're kind of left on your own. So what do you do? This is actually where Apache Bigtop comes in. And Apache Bigtop was meant to be to Hadoop ecosystem what Debian is to Linux. And I will explain why this analogy actually makes sense. It's a 100% open, community-driven distribution of big data based on Apache Hadoop, but we're also now embracing different technologies as well. An interesting thing is that pretty much every single vendor, on-prem, like Cloudera, Hortonworks, or IBM, or even cloud vendors, Amazon, Google, Trend Micro, kind of sort of fits into the same category, are using Bigtop to basically manage the distributions of Hadoop that they give to their customers. So Bigtop is full of the mechanics that let you put all of this bag of goods that is coming out of the Apache Software Foundation and have a cutting-edge, quickly evolving distribution and set of tools. So again, back to the analogy of why I think it's what Debian was to Linux. If you're old enough to remember how Linux got started, it basically got started on a bunch of floppy disks. And what you would do, you would compile your kernel, and then you would compile your dynamic loader, and then you would compile your bash, and you would boot from a floppy, and voila, you would have bash and nothing else, and that was awesome. But then, we all decided that while that was cool, what we really wanted is a slick Unix-like distribution, and Solaris at the time was giving us an example of what that could be. And Linux distributions appeared. So Debian was one of the first ones to be truly community-driven. There was no company behind it. There was nobody really bankrolling it. It was just a bunch of people. And it was a statement, a manifest from this single guy, who is unfortunately no longer with us, Ian Murdoch, that kind of started that whole movement. And I actually highly recommend going back and reading Debian Manifesto, because it's one of the best documents of open source collaboration you've ever seen in your life. Now, what Debian really did is it basically took this Linux kernel thing that was emerging. It took a whole bunch of GNU software. It put it all together, and it created a distribution. But then an interesting thing also happened, right? There was a whole bunch of secondary distributions derived from Debian. So you got Ubuntu with more of the focus on end user and polished desktop look and stuff like that. But you also had your Knoppix, which was basically the first distribution of Linux that could boot from a bootable media like DVD or USB. And that was a big deal. That was innovation. But the only reason that innovation was possible was because they were not really reinventing the distribution from scratch. They were basically reusing Debian and just putting it in a different environment, right? So Debian was basically the table stakes of the Linux distribution building business, and everybody else was reusing as much of it as possible. So that's exactly what Bigtop is trying to do. So Bigtop is basically trying to be in the middle, this sort of middle distribution that takes Hadoop, which is today HDFS and Yarn, but again, like I'm saying, we're sort of going beyond Hadoop as well. It takes all of the Hadoop ecosystem projects and then some more, and it puts it all together into essentially a distribution, providing all of the mechanics to build it, test it, deploy it, provide sort of recipes for cloud deployment, which I will be talking later in this presentation. But then again, an interesting thing is happening because all of these secondary distributions are basically leveraging Bigtop to build the distribution that they ship to their customers. Now, one interesting example of a distribution is OhDPI. And just very quickly, like I said, I have to do a little bit of a vendor pitch. Although OhDPI actually happens to be a nonprofit. So OhDPI is a nonprofit organization, essentially trying to standardize how a Hadoop distribution looks like. Part of the reason DataTorrent is actually a member of the OhDPI is because it used to be very difficult to write an application that would be truly cross-platform between different Hadoop distribution vendors, let alone different sort of versions of that same distribution. And OhDPI basically approached it from looking, at all these companies who had similar challenges and essentially telling them, why don't we simplify this eye chart of a matrix? Now, if you're asking yourself, what is this matrix? This is basically something that Gartner, Murph Adrian, put together. And this just lists, on the x-axis, all of the different distributions of Hadoop. And that's not even all of them, right? That's just the slice that he took. And then it basically lists all of the different components of the Apache software projects that basically go into this distribution. I think this is a fodder for data science because finding patterns in here is really difficult for me. And that was the point of OhDPI, because OhDPI basically said, let's at least agree on some commonality. Let's agree on some amount of common standards of what it means to be a distribution of Hadoop. And again, Bigtop played a big role in that because it already was providing some of it, but OhDPI just followed up sort of on the business development, I would say, side of things, right? Instead of just relying on developers to agree, we also invited project managers and said, like, hey, guys, instead of being all different in places where your customers don't really need you to be different, why don't we put it all together and provide a stable base for the Hadoop distribution, and then you can all innovate on top of it. So again, very quickly, just to close on the OhDPI. So right now is a good time to talk about OhDPI because right after this presentation, I'm about to cut a release of OhDPI 2.1. What will be in this release is runtime and operation specifications, which actually had a lot of input from our good folks at DataTorrent, Ampool, people who you saw as members on previous slides. So read through those specs. Again, those specs are meant to standardize what a Hadoop platform looks like. We also have special interest groups, and if you're interested in what they're trying to tackle, please join us. All of the OhDPI is nonprofit and open to public. Now, again, if you join us as a member company, you get an additional benefit in terms of free T-shirts and invitations to various events. It's a pretty good benefit, actually. But you can participate if you're just a developer, that's fine. And the way you can help is, you can bring your use cases to the table. So we have user advisory board. And if you have interesting ones, we can basically expose your use cases to the whole industry so that you don't have to fight that battle alone, right? You can actually find somebody who would help you fight that battle as well. And we can help you contribute to the SF projects. So if you, for example, struggling on, with how to get into the Apache community, we have a good set of experts. Hortonworks, obviously, is in OhDPI, who can actually train and teach you and sort of explain the Apache way. So again, come join us, and there's all sorts of value that you can get out of it. But back to Bigtop. So what's in Bigtop? Because, practically, what can you get your hands on today? So Bigtop, like I said, is the basis for OhDPI in terms of actual bits. right? The things that we as developers like to play with. So very quickly, what's in Bigtop? Well, first of all, it's a set of binary packages. So think of it just like any other distribution of Hadoop. You can just deploy that set of packages on your cluster. And essentially, just like some people still prefer to run Debian, not Ubuntu on their servers, you can just run Bigtop distribution. And some people do that. So there's actually a very big German company that runs Bigtop internally. Trend Micro, like I said, runs Bigtop internally, and a few others too. Now, in terms of the mechanics of how to put the distributions together, Bigtop comes with the integration code, packaging code, deployment, orchestration, validation, and continuous integration infrastructure. So let's very quickly get through all of this. So in terms of integration and packaging, in order for us to produce those RPM and Debian packages, we basically have to have source code that does that, so spec files and whatnot. We also trying to do things with Docker. So again, if you go into Bigtop and you look it up, and you would see that we have bits and pieces that Dockerize the distribution as well. And these images are essentially available for running as VM images or container images. We're still most of the time running in a very traditional sort of node-centric environment, but there are all these extensions available to you as well. And if you're interested in sort of trying something out and you don't quite see how, again, joining our mailing list is probably the best option. I mean, it's a very friendly mailing list. People are really eager to help you out. What else is there? So there is integration testing. So any package that gets into Bigtop has to come with integration level testing, which is actually very interesting because most Apache projects do a reasonably good job at the level of unit testing. So they can kind of like get through the motions, but all of the integration testing has typically been done by vendors. With Bigtop, you actually have integration testing that's done at the level of the community distribution. So what is our integration testing? It's basically a version set of artifacts. It's all JVM-based. Now, we don't care whether you program in Java or Scala or Clojure, but it actually has to be a JVM artifact. That's the fundamental requirement. But if it is, then it could run anywhere. And that running anywhere is actually a big deal because Bigtop today, unlike most of the commercial, well, actually unlike any of the commercial distributions, Bigtop today supports IBM's Power. So IBM's Hadoop is actually based on Bigtop. And Bigtop today supports ARM64, which again, none of the commercial vendors are actually supporting today. So again, having the test artifacts that are actually JVM-based test artifacts, help us still solve that heterogeneity of the hardware architecture, because otherwise we would still be in this world of pain trying to figure out how to run, Python, C and C++ library, between all these different architectures. So we prefer, like I said, we can accept anything that looks like a jar file. But we ourselves prefer Groovy. So again, if you're into testing in Groovy, I mean, there are actually very nice DSLs that you can do. So that's what we do. Now, one thing that I'm actually personally very excited about is our Puppet deployment. So this slide needs to be changed because, again, Bigtop 1.2 is about to be released today. So I'm actually doing 2 releases after the presentation. And there we're kind of migrating to the Puppet, Puppet 4. But the idea is still the same. It's a masterless Puppet, so you don't actually have to run a Puppet server, although you can. But the idea is that on every node, you would run this Puppet apply command, and then you would basically communicate to that command through HERA information, the topology of your cluster, and you get your cluster up and running. So this is how you would communicate the topology of your cluster. And again, without using any kind of tools like Ambari or Cloudera Manager, you would basically get a cluster very quickly. In fact, you can actually get a cluster on your laptop. In fact, that's exactly how I tested the release of Bigtop that I'm about to release. So remember I told you about the Docker images? So the combination of Puppet code and the Docker images allows you to do this. So, but before I show you how to do it, who is this for? Well, this is basically for Hadoop app developers, and this is to kind of like get you to the same environment that your cluster will be running in. Because typically developers tend to just, put a whole bunch of, jar files together, maybe some shell scripts to start things up. And if your application works in that environment, that's great. That's the first step. I mean, you should absolutely test it in that environment. But this is not the environment your application will be in when it gets deployed to a production cluster. So one of the things that Trend Micro, for example, uses Bigtop, Docker, and Puppet integration for is to guarantee 100% that at the end of the day, developer has access to exactly the same configuration that will be running on a physical big cluster, just the developer will have smaller amount of nodes. So implementation, how did we do this? Well, there is one script that you actually have to know about. There is a configuration file that is pretty tiny and small that you need to also consider. But other than that, you just run docker hadoop -c3, and by the magic of Docker Compose and Docker itself, these are the only components you need to have on your laptop. You basically get a 3 nodes fully distributed from a standpoint of a Hadoop distribution, Hadoop cluster running in Docker containers. It's actually very easy. It takes, so on this on that laptop, it takes about maybe less than a minute to provision it with just HDFS and Yarn. And if you add Apex to that, because Apex is also part of the Bigtop distribution, you basically have your environment in a matter of less than a minute that is very representative of the actual cluster. So that's actually pretty cool. I highly recommend you give it a go. It is also compatible with Docker Machine and Swarm, which means that the same configuration can actually be deployed on a real physical cluster that happens to have Docker, which actually goes back to my really sort of original beef with Apex these days that we've been just talking about. It's like Apex today just runs on Yarn. Like again, Yarn is nice, it's okay, it's Hadoopish, but there's so many other container orchestration systems that I would love Apex to run under, right? Docker Compose, I would love to have my cluster that way. Kubernetes, I would love to have my cluster that way. Bosch from Cloud Foundry, I would love to have my Apex cluster that way. Now, this is one of the ways you can actually achieve that. So again, because Docker Compose can run on essentially a Docker Swarm configuration, you can basically deploy the same configuration to a cluster. And again, that nice work was done by Fine Fox at Trend Micro, and that's how they basically tested out on what they consider to be a test cluster in the environment. So I have 5 minutes left, so I will quickly go through some of the other things that you can get out of Bigtop. So if you're interested in running on a public cloud, one option is to basically have Docker Swarm, which you can then use the way I showed you. Another option is to basically use this orchestration mechanism from Canonical, the makers of Ubuntu. So the makers of Ubuntu created this thing called Juju, which is basically meant to orchestrate any kind of distributed systems, right? It could be Hadoop, it could be distributed file systems, databases, anything at all. So the way you use it is literally just 2 commands, right? It's super cool and super easy on pretty much any public cloud today. So the first one is you just bootstrap Juju. That gives you a VM that is kind of like a control node in a typical Cloudera manager or Ambari. And then you basically use that control node to orchestrate the rest of the system. So Juju, interestingly enough, comes with integration with Bigtop right out of the box. So when you do Juju deploy Hadoop processing, it is the Bigtop code that is being used behind the scenes. And what it gives you is basically this. So this is a screenshot of a Juju UI that I got after running this second command from the previous slide. And all of this configuration, you see the little Bigtop signs came from Bigtop. So again, running on a public cloud, if you're interested in this really end-to-end orchestration system, Juju is actually a pretty good choice. And again, the integration with Bigtop is pretty tight, so we are really confident that the code will not break, at least in the simplest of cases. Now, again, with Juju, you can also resize your clusters elastically. So you can add units to the cluster. You can basically make it bigger when you need more processing power, things like that. So that's pretty nice. And you can even talk to individual sort of bits and pieces within the Juju configuration, and you can run unit tests. And again, unit tests in Juju are actually system integration tests that come from Bigtop, so that's how you do it. So here, for example, we're running the smoke test on a resource manager and a name node.
Can we go for question answers?
Sure, yes. So let me just very quickly say, yes, so they're pointing out that there's actually meant to be a Q&A session. So Bigtop is great. It's being used everywhere. So it's powering Trend Micro stack. It has various blueprints. And the only thing I would like to leave you with is that the only kind of blueprint we're missing is actually the kind of blueprint that Amol was talking about today on stage. So we really would like to have an architecture blueprint for a streaming type of an architecture, kind of like HDFS, but maybe not even HDFS, because you don't really need it a lot of times these days. Yarn Zookeeper, Kafka Apex, and something like Beam. If we can standardize on this configuration and then actually get it onto OhDPI, then maybe we can have Cloudera and Hortonworks and all these other guys actually ship Apex at the end of the day. So with that, let me open it up for Q&A.
Any questions? Please raise your hand.
You mentioned that you're a big fan of Groovy, And I was reading some time back that Pivotal had pulled support for development of Groovy. Is Groovy still being actively developed?
So the question is, what's the sort of pivotal story with Groovy? Since I'm very much.
Can you please come?
Oh, okay. Since I'm very much into Groovy. So Pivotal basically transitioned Groovy into the Apache Software Foundation. So Groovy is now a top-level project, and the developers that were working on the project within Pivotal, are now sort of working at other companies. But the project itself hasn't lost a single developer. In fact, since joining the ASF, it has actually gained quite a few developers. So it's very, very much active.